The heavy oak doors groaned as Elon Musk pushed them open, their echo swallowed by the cavernous stillness. The church was empty. It wasn't the kind of place he usually found himself, this man of technology, of progress, of boundless ambition. Yet here he was, his footsteps tapping softly against the cold stone floor. The air smelled of old wood and lingering incense, a strange mix of the ancient and the sacred. He stopped halfway down the aisle, a weight pressing against his chest. He didn't know why he was here. For months something had been tugging at him, something he couldn't explain. His eyes drifted over the empty pews, lifeless and still until they landed on the crucifix at the altar. The figure of Christ hung there, arms outstretched, gaze unyielding. A flicker of unease stirred inside him. Why did it feel like those? Carved eyes were looking straight through him. His knees buckled and he sank into a pew, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in decades, the ever-confident Elon Musk felt small. His successes, his failures, the questions he had spent his life trying to answer, they all pressed down on him at once. And then, he heard it. A voice, soft but firm, close yet distant. Why do you doubt? His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He sat frozen in place, convinced he had imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, his mind was playing tricks on him. But the words lingered, heavy and undeniable, like a presence wrapping around him. Why do you doubt? The voice wasn't accusing. It wasn't demanding. It was simply asking. Elon's rational mind fought against the impossibility of it, but the church seemed to grow colder, as if challenging him to deny what he had heard. His gaze snapped back to the crucifix. It looked different now. There was something in the eyes, something alive. The silence stretched, thick and unnatural. Slowly he stood, the air pressing against him as though the very atmosphere resisted his movement. Each step toward the altar felt heavier, like wading through something unseen. His voice, usually so, steady, wavered as he spoke. Who's there? His words bounced off the stone walls, swallowed by the vast emptiness. He turned, scanning the dimly lit church. Shadows stretched across the floor, unmoving. No one was there, yet he was not alone. Why do you doubt? The voice came again, louder, more insistent. Elon spun around, his breath quickening. His logical mind rebelled. This was impossible. He was alone, wasn't he? Who are you? His voice trembled now. If you're real, show yourself. Silence. But it wasn't an ordinary silence. It felt alive, as though it was waiting for him to understand something just beyond his reach. His eyes were drawn back to the crucifix. The figure of Christ shimmered in the dim light, the wood glowing faintly, impossibly. His legs threatened to give out, but he forced himself forward step by step until he stood before the altar. You have built your life on answers, the voice said, calm and steady. But not every question has one. The sound didn't come from around him. It came from within him, bypassing his ears entirely, resonating deep in his chest. His hands clenched, the back of a pew, his knuckles white. What does that mean? He whispered. The voice didn't reply right away, but a warmth began to spread through him, unlike anything he had felt before. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't reassuring. It was challenging. It peeled back something inside him, something he hadn't even realized was there. You have touched the stars, the voice continued, but you have ignored the ground beneath your feet. The words hit him like a shockwave. He thought of all he had achieved, the rockets, the innovations, the accolades, He had spent his life reaching forward, pushing boundaries, chasing the future. But had he ever stopped to look down, to consider what was already here? For the first time in his life, Elon Musk, the man who had spent his existence searching for answers, stood in a place where there were none. Only questions, only mystery. And maybe that was the answer he had been searching for all along. Everything he had built, everything that had come to fruition under his leadership, it was undeniable. Yet beneath it all, There had always been a restlessness, a gnawing void that no amount of success could fill. "You're not making sense," Elon muttered, shaking his head. He wasn't even sure who he was arguing with. "I've done more than most people could ever dream of. I've pushed boundaries, broken barriers. And yet, you doubt." The voice interrupted, gentle but firm. "You doubt your purpose. You doubt the source of your gifts. You doubt me." The words hung in the air like a challenge. A shiver ran down Elon's spine. He felt exposed, as though every hidden thought, every fear he had ever buried had been laid bare. The warmth surrounding him did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger, wrapping around him in a cocoon of light and silence that defied all reason. He should have been afraid. His entire life had been spent unraveling the mysteries of the universe through logic and reason. But this moment couldn't be explained, and yet there was no fear, only awe. How does a man react when the world he has built collides with something greater? Elon remained on his knees, time slipping away. Minutes, hours, it was impossible to tell. Finally, he found his voice again, weak, unsteady, desperate. "What do you mean? I was made for more?" His voice broke. "I've already done everything I thought I could. What else is there?" The silence stretched, deep and expectant. Then, the answer came. Not loud, not harsh, but firm and undeniable. "You have seen the power of creation, but you do not understand it." Elon's brow furrowed. "I've spent my life understanding creation," he argued, though even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. "I've built things no one thought possible. I've changed the world. And yet you do not see the source." The words struck like a blow. "You have marveled at the stars, but ignored the hand that placed them." Elon's breath caught in his throat. He had heard people speak like this before, of faith, of the divine. He had dismissed them, every time. To him, they were those who refused to confront the realities of science, of progress. But here, in this sacred space, those same words carried a weight he could not deny. How does a man of science reconcile with a truth that transcends it? His voice was raw when he spoke again. "Are you saying that everything I've done doesn't matter?" The warmth around him deepened, not in judgment, but in something else, something more powerful. "It matters," the voice answered. "But not in the way you think." Frustration bubbled to the surface. Elon clenched his fists. "I don't understand," he admitted. "What more am I supposed to do? What am I missing?" The crucifix shimmered again, the carved figure of Christ seeming to shift. And then, for the briefest moment, Elon could swear the eyes of the figure met his. His breath hitched. A raw, overwhelming wave of emotion crashed into him. He turned away, his vision blurring as tears streamed down his face. He couldn't explain why. "You are not the creator," the voice continued, steady but unrelenting. "You are a vessel. Through you I have given gifts to the world. But you have used them to glorify yourself rather than the one who gave them." The words cut deeper than he thought possible. All his life, he had prided himself on his achievements. The empire he had built with his own two hands. He had convinced himself that his purpose was to push humanity forward, to create, to innovate. But now, a painful truth began to take root. He had been searching for fulfillment in the wrong places. His voice barely a whisper, he asked, "What do you want from me?" "To see." The words were simple, but they carried a power that was undeniable. Elon's mind raced, trying to grasp their meaning. To see what? To see beyond yourself, to see the purpose for which you were created. Could he accept that? A purpose greater than his own ambition? The warmth around him shifted, and suddenly he was no longer in the church. The stone walls, the wooden pews, everything faded away, replaced by blinding light. Light, endless, infinite, stretching beyond comprehension. Elon's breath hitched as he stood in the midst of something beyond human understanding. Within the light, images began to take shape, faces, places, moments frozen in time. He saw the people he had helped, the lives changed by his innovations. A surge of pride swelled in his chest. But then, the images shifted. Now, he saw the ones he hadn't reached, the ones left behind in his relentless pursuit of progress. The weight of it was unbearable. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, tears spilling down his face. "I thought I was doing good," he choked out, his voice cracking. "I thought I was making a difference." "You have," the voice responded, steady, yet firm. "But you've only just begun. There is more to be done, more than you can imagine." The light began to fade, and slowly the familiar surroundings of the church returned. Elon found himself kneeling before the altar once more, the warmth lingering but the overwhelming presence beginning to withdraw. A strange mix of emotions surged within him. Relief, confusion, and an unshakable sense of purpose he couldn't yet define. Whatever had just happened, it had changed him. Would he have the strength to embrace this calling, or would his old ways pull him back? His voice, barely more than a whisper, trembled with uncertainty. "What do you want from me?" "You are here because you were called." The words struck him like a physical force. He staggered back, his mind reeling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He didn't believe in divine intervention. His world was built on facts, on logic, on equations that could be proven. And yet, as he turned his gaze back to the crucifix, something undeniable stirred within him. With shaking hands, he sank to his knees once more. "I don't understand," he admitted, voice thick with emotion. "I've done everything I thought I was supposed to do. Why do I still feel like it's not enough?" The silence in the church shifted, wrapping around him. Not emptiness, but something alive, something waiting. Then, for the first time, the voice spoke with unmistakable clarity. "Because you were made for more." The words pierced through him, sharp as an arrow, yet carrying a strange, quiet peace, as though he had been waiting his whole life to hear them without ever realizing it. His breath came in shaky gasps. Who was speaking to him? What did they mean by more? The stillness of the church no longer felt hollow. It was charged with an energy he couldn't define, a presence he couldn't explain. The warmth that had enveloped him didn't disappear. It had settled into something deeper, a quiet flame burning in his chest. He stayed there, trembling, lost in the weight of it all. Everything he thought he knew, about the world, about himself, had been shattered. He had always believed in reason, in logic. But this defied all explanation. And yet, it was undeniable. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. His legs were unsteady, as though they no longer belonged to him. He glanced, once more at the crucifix, half expecting it to shimmer again, but the figure of Christ remained still, serene. The church was silent, but it was not empty. Something still lingered, watching, waiting. What was expected of him now? Elon turned and began walking down the aisle, his footsteps echoing through the vast space. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay still. His mind was a storm of thoughts, the vision, the faces, the people he had helped, the people he had failed to help. As he reached the heavy oak doors of the church, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the handle, but he didn't push it open. Something held him back. "You are not the creator. You are a vessel." The words echoed within him, louder than before. He closed his eyes and gripped the door handle as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The vision had changed everything. But what came next? The screen, the weight of his old life pressing against the fragile sense of purpose that had just begun to take root within him. For years, every decision had been about progress, about pushing forward, about proving something to the world, to himself. But now he wasn't sure what he was proving anymore. His thumb hovered over the screen. He could respond, fall back into the familiar rhythm of his life, of expectations and obligations. Or he could take a different path. With a slow exhale, he locked the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. For the first time in as long as he could remember, the urgency to respond, to act, to control, wasn't there. Instead, he lifted his gaze to the night sky, the stars burning quietly above. He wasn't alone, and though he didn't yet know where this road would lead, he knew one thing for certain. He was finally ready to walk it. The screen glowed in his hand, its familiar pull calling to him. For years, his life had revolved around progress, innovation, and proving himself to the world. He had convinced himself that success would bring him fulfillment, but standing there, on the cusp of something greater, he realized how empty those victories had been. They were nothing compared to the peace he had felt in the church, the warmth of that unseen presence that had spoken to him. With a slow breath, he put the phone back in his pocket and continued walking. This time, he knew where he was going. Not to a boardroom, not to a lab, but to the people. The vision had been clear. He was meant to share his story, to use the platform he had built not for his own glory but for something far greater. Would the world accept his message, or would they turn away? The thought terrified him, but it also drove him. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in his life he was willing to walk a path he hadn't charted himself. Elon's steps carried him home in the quiet hours before dawn, but his mind was anything but quiet. The prayer he had whispered outside the church echoed in his heart, grounding him as he prepared for what was to come. For so long he had been the architect of his own story, but now for the first time he felt as though he was being written into something far greater. By the time he reached his house, the first light of morning was creeping over the horizon. He stepped inside, the quiet hum of the home greeting him. Normally he would have gone straight to his study, diving into emails, schedules, and plans. But not today. Today he walked past it all, straight to the small sitting room he rarely used. He sank into the armchair by the window, his gaze drifting to the sliver of sky visible beyond the city skyline. His phone sat heavy in his hand, a reminder of the world waiting for him, the world he now felt called to reach. Would he be brave enough to speak the truth, knowing it might cost him everything? The vision came rushing back, himself standing before crowds, not as a billionaire, not as an inventor, but as a man with a story to tell. He had spent his entire life building machines, pushing boundaries, striving for progress. Now he was being asked to build something far more fragile. Faith. He opened his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. Where would he begin? How could he explain what had happened without sounding unhinged? The world knew him as a man of logic, of science, someone who solved problems with equations and ingenuity. How could he make them believe in something that defied all of that? The answer came, quiet but sure. Start with the truth. Taking a deep breath, he began to type. At first the words came slowly, but soon they flowed freely, as though they had been waiting to be released. He didn't overthink it. He simply wrote what was on his heart. When I walked into the church that night, I was a man with questions. Questions no amount of success could answer. But I left with something I never expected. Clarity. I heard a voice not in my head but in my heart. It told me I was made for more, that all I've achieved is nothing compared to the purpose I was created for. And for the first time in my life, I felt peace. He paused, his hands trembling. Would people believe him? Would they mock him? He didn't know. But for the first time, he realized it didn't matter. This wasn't about his reputation. It wasn't even about his legacy. It was about the message. Would this simple message inspire millions to listen? Or would it fall on deaf ears? With a final deep breath, he hit send. The message was out there now, beyond his control. He leaned back in his chair, the first rays of sunlight spilling over his face. He didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time, he was okay with that. because this wasn't about him. It was about something far greater. And that was all the clarity he needed. As the sun climbed higher, Elon sat motionless, staring at his phone. The message he had sent was still fresh on the screen,